Yeah, it's kind of like Steve Carell says in The 40-Year-Old Virgin, it just never happened. I don't know. I will just preface this by saying this story does take place in a hospital, and it involves patients. And everything has been anonymized. I've changed around details to protect everybody's confidentiality, because that's important. I was standing by the nursing station with Bob and Tom, two senior residents that I was working with at the time, in the intensive care unit. And the intercom goes off overhead hospital-wide, code Omega, bed 4, cardiovascular ICU. And I immediately got that feeling as though my heart is kind of up where my ears should be and in my throat, my hair's standing on end, and I can feel my heart start to race because something pretty important is happening right next door. At the time, I was a fourth-year medical student doing an elective rotation, a 4-week rotation in the intensive care unit. I had already gone through the mandatory rotations of family medicine and OBGYN, surgery, and now had some time to kind of explore interests and things that didn't get touched on along the way. And I had wanted to be there because I didn't have a lot of experience dealing with critically ill patients, and I thought that that would serve me well in the future. At this time, I was 3 weeks into the 4-week block and starting to kind of feel like, you know, I had my sea legs a little bit. I kind of understood the ebb and flow of the day-to-day routine. And we weren't really doing much at the time, and so the three of us kind of looked at each other and thought, well, it's just next door. Maybe we'll go see if we can help out. The way that this area is situated is that there's the medical surgical ICU, which is where I was spending most of my time. And those patients who stay there are ones who've had very serious infections of almost any kind, traumas, bad car accidents, gunshot wounds, or complicated surgeries. Whereas the cardiovascular unit is mostly reserved for people who've had open heart surgery or surgery on some of the large arteries in the body. On the back of the ID card that we got, there's a list of all the overhead codes. And so some of the ones that you hear from House or ER, code blue usually means that it's a cardiac arrest or somebody's stopped breathing, needs urgent attention. Code red means that there's a fire somewhere or smoke coming out of someplace there shouldn't be. Code brown means exactly what you think it does. But code omega is different, doesn't get a fancy color, and what it means is that they're activating the massive transfusion protocol, which means that somebody's in pretty dire need of a lot of blood transfusion. And so we go through the double doors into the cardiovascular unit, and over by the corner, there's probably about 35 people clustered around this bed, nursing staff, resident doctors, postgraduate fellows, staff physicians, hospital attendants, and it's chaos. There's people are yelling instructions to each other. There's monitors beeping and blaring and making all sorts of noises. There's IV bags hanging what looks like blood products, medications, IV fluids, and the floor is littered with sterile wrapping from instruments and syringes and things like that that have been opened in haste. And I make eye contact across the room with, I'm going to call her Dr. Sally. Dr. Sally was the attending staff in the cardiovascular unit, and she'd helped organize my rotation. And she kind of did one of these, and so the three of us went over to see if we could help out. And as I got closer to the group, I could see the rising and falling of somebody's shoulders near the bedside, and I knew that they were performing CPR. And the way that this usually works is it's quite protocolized. There's a series of rotating 2-minute shifts. In between, you do checking for pulse, you check for the heart rhythm, you administer medications, and then decide if you need to keep going or if you kind of need to change trajectory. And so what really was necessary at that time is people to get in line to relieve the person who was doing CPR before them. CPR it's a physical activity. It's quite exhausting, actually, and if you don't break a sweat while you're doing it, you're probably doing it wrong. The textbooks will say that you're supposed to compress the chest 2 inches. and that you have to do this at a rate of about 100 times per minute. There's some humorous videos out there, actually, that say if you think, and I want you all to do this now, if you kind of hum along in your head the Bee Gees song, Staying Alive. You got it? The beat to that song is about 100 beats per minute. And so that's the kind of pace that you need to keep up. The thing with CPR is that it's quite traumatizing. It's traumatizing for the patient, obviously. The patients are also dead if they're requiring CPR, which is arguably more traumatizing. But it's also quite traumatizing for the people administering it. To do it properly, because of the depth that you have to achieve, you have to pump and relax the heart because it's not doing it itself. And this requires breaking the ribs, essentially, most of the time. It was something that I had done before. I was prepared for that feeling. But I think I'm going to have to argue that meeting somebody for the first time while you're performing CPR on them is probably the strangest way to meet somebody. And that's how I met Mr. Smith, not his real name. Mr. Smith was late middle age, 55, 65, somewhere around there. And I met him, and he was lying on his back. He'd been receiving CPR. His eyes were half closed, his mouth was half open. And it was my turn to next in line. And so I started humming along to Staying Alive in my head. And part of me, of course, my adrenaline is pumping, not really thinking straight, I'm kind of just following directions. Part of me is going as a medical student, this is so cool. And the other part of me, which is getting louder and louder, saying, this is totally fucked up. At that time, Dr. Sally started kind of barking directions, and we learned a bit more about Mr. Smith. He had been admitted the night before, and he had what's called an aortic aneurysm in his chest. The aorta is the largest artery in the body. It comes out from the heart, goes down through the chest into the abdomen, and every other artery that we have is a downstream tributary of that. And an aneurysm means that instead of a nice, smooth pipe lining of an artery, for whatever reason, it's become kind of sagging and outpouching and not at all strong. And these things are watched until a decision is made that they need to be intervened on, usually with surgery, to prevent them from bursting or rupturing, which is usually fatal. And so it was pretty clear that this is probably what had happened, that he was waiting for surgery the next day, but that it wasn't soon enough. And so as we're going through the protocol, switching every 2 minutes, I look up and I see Dr. Gavin walk in the room. And Dr. Gavin is a heart surgeon. And heart surgeons are badass. I mean, to be honest, pretty much any surgeon is kind of badass because, at least the way I look at it, is if somebody's going to cut into you and put you back together, you want them to have a pretty good sense of self-identity. But I would say that heart surgeons are probably closer to one extreme of that, as they should be. Because this guy's 9 to 5 is showing up in the morning, having his Starbucks, sawing through your chest bone, cracking your rib cage open, stopping your heart, putting you on bypass, cutting into it, doing whatever needs to be done, sewing it back up, restarting your heart, and then putting everything back together in time for his kid's soccer game at 3 p.m. So Dr. Gavin walked in, and he's kind of older gentleman, olive complexion, little salt and pepper at the sides, exudes confidence. Definitely the type of guy you'd want messing around with your heart. In a literal sense, not... Yeah. And so he comes in and kind of appraises the situation and, starts instructing people around. And by this point, it's my time again to keep performing CPR. And so I'm stationed on the left side of the patient's body, and all of a sudden I kind of get nudged to the side. And he's standing beside me, he's got a mask on, he's got surgical gloves, and he says, just keep going, just move over a bit. And pretty soon he's starting to splash pink cleaning fluid on the patient's side right beside me. And I realize that the holy fuck part of my brain is getting louder and louder. In the meantime, as to not interrupt the rhythm, nursing staff are reaching from behind me, putting a face shield over my face, putting a gown around me. I kind of switch, somebody switches in for a couple beats, I put on some gloves and keep going. And all of a sudden, Dr. Gavin has a scalpel in his hand, and he's performing an incision called a thoracotomy in between the ribs on the left side. First through the skin, then the muscle, and then the tissue to access the chest cavity. The average adult male has about 5 liters of blood in total, and each half of the chest can hold about 2.5. And so by the time that he gets into the chest and he gets a big clamp to stick in the incision and then crack it open like a clamshell to access the space, I realize why I have the face shield on. And next thing he knows, he says, "Stop doing compressions." So I stop. And then he reaches his hand inside the patient's chest and starts to scoop out blood clots. So we had been correct in assuming that this is what had happened to Mr. Smith, is that this aneurysm had burst. He was bleeding into his chest. And I apologize in advance for describing it this way, but you know at Thanksgiving or like holiday dinner, I don't know, doctors and nurses are weird people because we relate everything to food, which is disgusting. But I think it's probably because we're so hungry all the time. So you know at Thanksgiving dinner, the cranberry sauce, not like the nice stuff that your grandma makes on the stove and like stews down over 2 hours. I'm talking like ocean spray. You know, that comes in the can, and then when you open the can and kind of makes a onto the saucer, but it holds its shape completely. Yeah. So that's what blood clots look like. And that's what Dr. Gavin is scooping out of Mr. Smith's chest in about grapefruit-sized chunks. Meanwhile, he tells me to keep going. So I do. And then he tells me to stop again. He's cleared enough of the bleeding. And meanwhile, everything else is still going on. People are running around. Blood is getting poured in. Medications are being administered. We're rotating every 2 minutes. And he tells everybody to stop because he's feeling for the hole with his hand. He's feeling for the defect in the artery to see if it's amenable to being stitched back together. All of this time is probably 35 minutes or so, and Mr. Smith still doesn't have a pulse. But after a very quick conversation between him and Dr. Sally, it's decided, let's take him to the operating room. And the operating room is situated about 300 meters away down a hallway that connects the intensive care units across this kind of walkway bridge. And that's where we have to get him to. So as soon as that decision is made, things start happening very quickly. Somebody runs and calls the OR and gets everybody in place there. Nurses are amazing people. I have the utmost respect for them because they seem to be able to do 50 things at once. And as soon as that decision is made, there's hands everywhere. It seems like everybody's grown an extra pair, disconnecting IV lines, connecting IV lines, disconnecting monitors, putting on IV monitors, putting in a breathing tube, getting everything ready for transportation. Clean sheets are brought out to cover up the carnage. And one of the other residents that I'm with, it's his turn, and so he, to get the 300 meters, has to jump on the bed and straddle the patient and continue doing chest compressions while we do the 300-meter dash. At this time, we kind of look up, and I'm able to take a step back from the bed for the first time in a while. And I look across the room, and this image will be forever seared in my brain. I see the patient's family standing in the corner. It's actually quite common for patients' families to be present during resuscitation. Some people find it quite useful and quite therapeutic so that they can see what's being done to their loved ones. And as we start moving out, the patient's wife is there, his children, who are adult children, and they start cheering. And they start cheering and clapping, not for me certainly, not for the surgeon, not for the nurses, but for their dad. They start saying, "Let's go, Dad. We know you can do this. Keep fighting. We'll see you on the other side." And they start cheering him on. We get out through the doors and we go down the 300 meters or so. into the operating room, get him up on the operating room table, and continue this protocol every 2 minutes, switching people and medications. And then all of a sudden somebody says, wait, I have a pulse. And we check the neck, the groin, and there's a pulse. And so we check his blood pressure, he has a blood pressure. We look at the heart monitor, and he's got regular heart activity. And so we kind of step away. And then things start happening really fast, and we're essentially ushered out of the operating room so that, Dr. Gavin can saunter in and make his kid's soccer practice. Myself and the residents start heading back to the ICU, and we stop on this bridge and kind of pause and look at each other. And they were much more senior than I was at that time, but we were all white as a sheet, trembling, sweaty, and look at each other and kind of say, well, now what? Nobody really had a good suggestion. This has been going on for over an hour. So we went and had lunch. About 2 hours later, there was a debriefing session that Dr. Sally had organized and got everybody together in one room. And we learned that Mr. Smith had passed away, that he didn't survive the operation, which is terribly sad, of course, for him and for his family. He had an almost, a disease that's almost universally fatal, and so it's not surprising, but the loss of human life is, of course, still a tragedy. And at that time, kind of coming over me, I remember feeling very fatigued, very heavy, and a little bit angry. Not necessarily angry that he hadn't survived. I felt grief about that, but angry that we had done so much to him and that it hadn't been for anything in the end. And Dr. Sally started talking to everybody, and she actually broke down in tears in front of everyone and said that these are the types of situations that you gain experience from, but that you never really get comfortable with. And that's probably a good thing. And that the idea of professional detachment, of an ironclad white coat, is probably not best for you and not best for your patients. And she said that she knew that she'd go home later that night and talk to her family and that she'd cry again. And when I went home that night, I cried too. Meeting with her again at the end of the next week for the kind of exit interview. Of course, we talked about this event. And I was relating to her how scared I had felt at the time because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening, and I was only just able to follow directions. And she gave me some of the best advice that I've ever had in my life. She said that whenever you're feeling that way and you can identify a scenario that makes you feel that way, what's important is that you run towards the fear. That you identify it, that you call it by a name, and that you run towards it. And that you seek out these experiences, because by doing that, you'll move from being afraid to just being scared. And I think there's an important difference there that she explained to me. If you're afraid of something, you avoid it. You say, oh, somebody else can deal with that. I'll just go over here. I'll just pretend like I don't need to know what to do in that scenario. It makes me uncomfortable. But if you gain experience in that, and it doesn't have to be something so dramatic and graphic, moving across the country, asking somebody out on a date, applying for a new job, quitting your job, right? If you run towards the fear, then the next time that comes around, you'll be better prepared. And you might be scared about it, and you might be anxious about it, but you know how to react. And so I think that looking back on that, I think that's a message that's able to be transferred out of the intensive care unit. And even though all these terrible things happened, I think at the end of the day, that's what I thank Mr. Smith for teaching me. Thank you.
Kevin Venus.